The French Revolution is one of the most significant events in European history. The culmination of the ideas of the Age of Enlightenment. It was inspired by the American Revolution, but ironically also driven largely by the practical impacts of the debt that the French had accrued supporting the Americans in their revolution. The French Revolution spurred a wave of revolution and anti-revolution that embroiled the continent of Europe in war for more than the next 20 years. And perhaps nothing better illustrates the chaos of the era than the odd time when a French army with little loyalty to France was sent under the command of an American who didn't speak French, wearing British uniforms, to Wales in an attempt to turn the Welsh against the English on behalf of the French, only to be confronted by a cannon with no shot, a sunken Portuguese merchant vessel, and a 6-foot-tall female cobbler with a pitchfork. The so-called last invasion of Britain is history that deserves to be remembered. In 1795, revolutionary France was embroiled in the War of the First Coalition, the first of the so-called French Revolutionary Wars, which pitted European imperial powers bent on limiting the extent of the revolution against a French Revolutionary Army looking to spread their revolutionary ideas. In June, the British had landed an army of French immigrés, counter-revolutionary troops who had fled to England in the hopes of supporting internal royalist uprisings. The immigrés, mainly from the French noble class, and their British allies were convinced the whole of Western France was ripe for a revolt that would restore the French monarchy. The invasion turned out to be a disaster, and its defeat a significant blow to the French royalist cause. It also resulted in the capture of a huge amount of supplies, more than 4,000 wagons worth, and nearly 70,000 muskets. It also helped the reputation of the general of the French Revolutionary Army, Louis Lazare Hoche. The following year, the French finally saw the opportunity they had waited for. Victories in 1795 had created governments allied to France in Spain and the Netherlands, and their combined fleet was larger than that of Great Britain. The time had finally come, the French thought, for an invasion of Britain. While much of the army was committed to an invasion of Italy under the rising general Napoleon Bonaparte, the French made an ambitious plan to invade the British Isles under the 28-year-old Hoche. The plan involved a significant portion of the French fleet and some 40,000 troops, many, ironically, outfitted with the equipment that Hoche had captured during the failed British invasion the year before. The attacks would take place over the winter of 1796 and 97. The centerpiece of the attack was what the French called the Expedition to Ireland. A large force, directly under the command of Lazare Hoche, planned to land in Ireland in support of an outlawed group called the Society of United Irishmen. Central to the invasion plan was an Irish nationalist named Theobald Wolfe Tone, who was a founding member of the United Irishmen and is seen by many as the father of Irish republicanism. Tone had managed to convince the French that Ireland was ready for popular rebellion. The idea was appealing to the French, who saw Ireland as the least defensible of the British Islands. An extension of the revolution with the Republic of Ireland would have been both an ideological and a military coup. The plan was further encouraged by the rather optimistic claim by the Society of United Irishmen that they could raise 250,000 Irish rebels to support the invasion. But the plan also included direct attacks on British soil. 2 large diversionary forces were envisioned to distract the English from sending reinforcements to Ireland, to cause chaos, and possibly to cause a popular uprising. One diversionary force was to land near Newcastle in the hopes of spurring an uprising by the working class, and the second was to move on Bristol on England's southwest coast, an important centre for shipping, and then to march north to Wales, where the hope was that the population would be sympathetic and rise against England. They would then move to sack the city of Liverpool and eventually meet up with the northern force. But the plan was troubled from the start. Most of the trained and experienced Revolutionary Army troops were required for wars on the continent. And so while the plan originally called for 40,000 troops, in the end, the main invasion of Ireland under General Hoche included only 14,000 troops, and the best troops available were assigned to that group. The first of the 3 groups to set sail was the Northern Diversionary Force, leaving from Dunkirk in November of 1896. But the force quickly ran into rough seas, and the transports became unmanageable. The troops aboard, of poor quality as the best troops had been assigned to the Ireland landing, demanded that the ships return to port, and some vessels were lost. The plan for the Northern Diversionary Force was abandoned. The main force met with similar disaster. Although they avoided the English fleet, they encountered rough weather that battered the ships. When they arrived off Ireland, the water was too rough to attempt a landing. The fleet tried to return home, but between the storm and encounters with the Royal Navy, 12 vessels and over 2,000 soldiers and sailors were lost. Not one had made it to shore except as a prisoner. The invasion was a total disaster. But despite the failure of the other two elements, the French decided to go along with the invasion in the south, which now was simply going to be a raiding party since there was no longer a main attack from which they were supposed to be a diversion. The southern force was designated the 2nd Legion of France. However, they were generally called Le Légion Noire, or the Black Legion. This was because their uniforms were among the equipment that had been captured in the failed Immigrant invasion in 1795, and as those uniforms were British, they had been dyed scarlet. Attempts to re-dye them had produced mixed results that looked either dark brown or black. As Hoche had reserved his best troops for the expedition to Ireland, much of the force was a penal battalion, made up of the poorest soldiers and malcontents scraped from the Revolutionary Army, or prisoners who were promised release if they joined the expedition. The reasoning was that the highest quality soldiers were not necessary for a force intended only as a diversion, and that the troops there were to cause trouble anyway. Moreover, there was little risk. If the group failed, they would simply mean fewer mouths for the army to feed. From the French perspective, there was little downside to releasing a group of scoundrels loose in Britain. Their leader was Colonel William Tate. Tate was an Irish-American who had been a captain in the American Revolutionary War and had come out with a virulent hate for the British. Some stories claim that his family had been killed by loyalists in that war. In 1793, he was involved in a scheme for the French to raise a force of frontiersmen to take Louisiana from the Spanish. The plot had been revealed and had fallen through, leaving him exiled from America and believing that the French owed him reimbursement for the money he had committed to raising the troops. He had fled to France, where he had demanded a commission and reimbursement. His military experience and fanatical hatred for the British made him a good fit to lead the expedition, but it's also possible that Hoche selected him simply to remove a nuisance. Unfortunately, the fiery Tate did not speak French. At the last minute, a group of regulars became available because Napoleon no longer needed more men for his Italian campaign. Thus, the Légion Noire was some 1,400 strong, with 600 of those being regulars and the rest the penal battalion. The force was carried in 4 ships, including 2 40-gun frigates. The fleet sailed from Brest on February 16, 1797. Tate's orders were to bring as much chaos and confusion to the heart of Britain as was possible, to recommend and facilitate a rising of the British poor against the government, but whenever and wherever possible, to wage war against the castle, not the cottage. When the fleet made it to the Bristol Channel, the winds were not favorable to proceed to Bristol. Waiting for more favorable weather offered too much risk, so they decided to sail to Wales, where they would be less likely to be discovered. They sailed near the town of Fishguard, which had a harbour in the northern Wales county of Pembrokeshire, arriving February 22nd. But by then their fleet had been recognized, and the alarm was being spread. They sent the smallest of their vessels, the 14-gun Voiture, to reconnoiter, flying a British flag. But as soon as it rounded the corner to the harbor, a cannon thundered. The Voiture realized that the harbor was well defended and fled. The captain of a small merchant vessel was captured and likewise warned that the fortress was well defended. It was a lie. The fortress at Fishguard not only had a small garrison of irregulars, at the time the commander of the fort reported that the entire fort only had 3 cannon rounds. The shot had been fired was not an attack, but had actually been fired without a shell. It was a blank, most likely a salute for what they saw as an English ship. The merchant captain had deliberately exaggerated. Had the force landed that day, they could have likely taken the entire county before the militia had even been able to gather and landed without opposition. But the French Navy had been repelled by only 1 cannon, fired without a shell. The French naval ships were worried as they now knew they had been discovered and were anxious to unload the troops. They unloaded in the middle of the night at a rocky point some 2 miles from Fishguard. Given the difficulty of the operation, the landing went well, with little loss, but 1 boat did founder, taking with it most of the expedition's artillery. The fleet then left, leaving Tate on his own. In 1794, the British Prime Minister had called for the counties to form forces of volunteer militia to be called upon in case of invasion. A local landowner named William Knox had formed a militia in Fishguard at his own expense under the condition that his son be made commander. But the force was poorly trained and equipped and numbered in total only some 300 men. The colonel in charge, William Knox's son Henry, had no actual military experience. Knox received word that a French force had been sighted on the afternoon of February 22nd, but as his militia was still gathering, he decided against making an attack right away. Had he moved quickly, it is possible that he could have caught the French before unloading and fended them off. Instead, he returned to a defensive position at Fishguard Castle. He had, however, taken a coastal route to the fort, and some accounts claim that the militia, followed by a throng of local onlookers, had appeared as a much larger force than they were, and that is what had prompted the French fleet to leave. Knox started sending messages, and militia started gathering in nearby counties as well. Tate put his regulars in good defensive positions, but supply was an issue. He dispatched the irregulars to collect food from the nearby farms. But then he had another problem. Some weeks before, a Portuguese merchant vessel carrying a load of wine had foundered off the coast. Crates of wine had been floating onto the beaches, where it had been collected by the locals. When the poorly disciplined irregulars went to forage, they found farms laden with bottles of wine. Quickly, Tate's irregulars had become drunk and useless. Reportedly, the local cobbler, a woman in her 40s named Jemima Nicholas, had captured 12 drunk Frenchmen using only a pitchfork. More than half of the French force had been defeated by a Portuguese ship that had sunk weeks before they had arrived. Realizing that he was greatly outnumbered, Knox decided to retreat, but reversed the decision when his retreating force ran into reinforcements. By the time the militia had all gathered in the late afternoon of the 23rd, along with locals who had armed themselves and a group of sailors collected from local revenue vessels, they still numbered only some 700 against Tate's regulars. They decided to mount an attack, but again vacillated and decided to return to the fort. It was growing dark. This turned out to be fortunate, as Tate's grenadiers had prepared an ambush that could have been very deadly for the militia had they been caught marching. But in the dark, Tate had no idea how large a force he was facing and assumed that he was, by then, greatly outnumbered. The Welsh, whom Tate had been told were on the verge of rebellion, were in fact up in arms against him. Much of his force had disappeared, deserted, or were too drunk to return, and his entire force was on the verge of mutiny. Realizing his position was hopeless, he sent 2 officers to town to negotiate a surrender. Tate's force surrendered the next day, and the 3-day invasion ended without a fight. When news of invasion reached London, it initially sparked a panic and a run on the banks, which caused the government to temporarily make the British currency inconvertible, which means it could not be exchanged for the gold that represented its underlying value. While that is common practice today, it is thought to be the first time that banknotes issued by a central bank were made inconvertible. Tate and the rest of the French force were taken as prisoners of war and were returned to France in a prisoner exchange later the same year. Tate eventually returned to the United States. 2 of the French ships from the invasion were caught by the Royal Navy and forced to surrender. The frigate La Resistance was taken into the Royal Navy and given the name HMS Fishguard. Jemima Nicholas became a local folk hero. She died in 1832. Lazare Hoche, when he returned to France, was sent to fight the Austrians on the Rhine front, where he won a major victory and eventually was made Minister of War. Of all the generals of the French Revolutionary Army, he was perhaps the greatest rival for Napoleon Bonaparte, but he died in 1797 of consumption at just the age of 29. The United Irishmen staged a rebellion in Ireland in 1798, but it was poorly organized and poorly supported by the French. A small French force landed in Ireland to support them, but was quickly defeated. A second invasion force was caught at sea and forced to surrender after a short naval battle. Wolfe Tone was captured with this force. He was tried by court-martial and sentenced to death, but committed suicide before he could be executed. The rebellion was defeated, with an estimated 10,000 people killed. The wars of the French Revolution would give way to the Napoleonic Wars, and Britain and France would remain at war pretty much constantly until 1815. Despite many grand plans, Bonaparte never again landed French troops on British soil. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.